Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications. The following program is a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts Network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com to learn more about this and our other weekly storytelling programs. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Good evening. I'm storyteller Otis Jiry, and I ain't your grandfather. From where I'm from, we don't do bedtime stories. And if that's what you were expecting, you're in the wrong place. If it's terrifying tales you're after, well then, I've got just the thing. Get comfortable, settle in, turn off the lights, if you dare. Your night is about to get a whole lot darker. Who needs sleep anyway?
Good evening, friends. It's Sunday night, and that means it's time to dim the lights, get comfortable, and prepare for another evening of eerie encounters, unsettling mysteries, and stories designed to make you question what's working just beyond the veil of memory. I'm your host, Otis Jiry, and tonight's tales takes us into the realm of things left behind, things erased, things buried, and things that refuse to stay forgotten. Some disappear without a trace, others come back when no one is looking, and some were never truly gone to begin with.
There's something about being forgotten that unsettles me, Otis. Maybe it's the idea that you could just slip through the cracks. One day you're here, and the next, it's like you never were.
That's the terrifying part, isn't it? The thought that reality isn't solid as we'd like to think. But if tonight's stories prove anything, Malcolm, it's that even when the world forgets something, something always remembers.
And when it comes back, it's usually not empty-handed.
That's the truth. Our first tale tonight takes us into the depths of a secret project that should have stayed buried. An experiment lost to time until it wasn't. And what it uncovered. Well, it was never meant to be found again, so sit back, my friends, and keep an eye on the things you thought were lost. Before we begin, I'd like you to know that if you enjoyed tonight's tales but want even more, we've got just the thing for you.
By joining our patrons area, you'll unlock the full extended episode, featuring all stories without interruptions, plus access to our entire Simply Scary Podcast Network archive. All this for just $7.99 a month, or save even more with an annual plan.
Head over to simplyscarypodcast.com and select patrons in the top menu. You'll be directed to chillingtalesfordarknights.com, where you can start your membership and step deeper into the darkness.
Support indie creators, enjoy ad-free episodes, and double the horror. What could be better? Join us today. Thanks so much for your support. Now, back to the show.
Our first story tonight takes us deep into the shadows of history, where a long-buried experiment resurfaces with chilling consequences. Some things were meant to be forgotten, locked away where no one can find them. But what happens when they find us first? This is Project Starlight by Charlotte Morrow, performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. Part 1. The air in Nathaniel Ross's basement carried the stale scent of things abandoned. Dust and mildew thickened in the corners, creeping over old furniture draped in sheets. The basement itself was larger than expected, the concrete walls marked with faint discolorations where shelves had once been bolted. Cardboard boxes sat undisturbed along the perimeter, their edges softened by time. Agent Michael Graves adjusted the grip on his flashlight, its narrow beam cutting across the dimly lit room. Beside him, his partner, Agent Rebecca Thatcher, exhaled sharply. She had a hand pressed against her hip, her expression unreadable. "Doesn't look like much," she muttered, kicking at the dirt-encrusted floor. You'd think a guy storing classified intelligence would invest in a better hiding place. Michael didn't respond. His attention had settled on something that didn't belong. A section of wall near the far corner where the cinder blocks didn't quite align. The misalignment was subtle, but once seen, it was impossible to ignore. The mortar was thinner, the seams sharper. A false wall. He turned back toward the forensic team combing through the space. "Pry this open," he ordered. It took a few minutes. The first strike of the crowbar sent a dry crack echoing through the basement. Splinters of wood and plaster crumbled away, revealing the rough edges of a panel embedded into the concrete. Another pull and the entire section groaned forward, shifting loose from whatever frame held it in place. Behind it, a recessed cavity stood revealed. Inside, a wooden crate sat nestled against the exposed foundation. The crate was unmarked, save for a few faded scuffs on its surface. The nails securing it were rusted. Someone had meant for this to stay buried. One of the techs, a younger man with wire-framed glasses, hesitated. "You sure about this?" Michael met his gaze without flinching. "Open it." The man exhaled through his nose before crouching down, wedging a pry bar against the lid. The wood groaned, then splintered. A stale odor rose as the top was pulled away. Inside the crate, beneath layers of aged wax paper, lay stacks of yellowed documents, fragile with time. Atop them, resting like relics unearthed from another era, sat two undeveloped film reels, their metal casings tarnished with rust. The labels were handwritten in black marker. Starlight Project, Session 5. Rebecca leaned in, nudging the edge of a small leather-bound journal with her gloved fingertips. The binding had cracked with age, the spine nearly disintegrating. She opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the brittled pages. Her brow furrowed. "This isn't just stolen intelligence," she murmured. "This is something else." Michael lifted one of the reels, turning it over in his hands. It felt heavier than it should have, dense in a way that suggested its contents carried weight beyond their physical form. The handwriting on the journal's final page caught his eye. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. The children were never terminated, only contained. A silence stretched between them. Rebecca closed the journal carefully, as if half expecting it to crumble in her hands. Michael exhaled slowly. "Get these reels developed," he said, his voice quieter now. "I want to know exactly what we're dealing with." The motel was the kind of place designed to be forgotten. Its sign flickered against the darkness, casting a sickly orange glow over the cracked pavement of the parking lot. Michael checked in without much thought, taking the key from the front desk without acknowledging the clerk's tired expression. The room smelled of stale air and old carpet. The furniture had seen better days, the walls adorned with generic paintings of places that didn't exist. The television, bolted to a chipped wooden dresser, hummed with static before Michael switched it off. His laptop sat open on the small desk, a dim glow spilling across the surface. The film reels had been processed hours earlier, their contents digitized for review. He'd already watched the footage twice. The third time wouldn't change what he'd seen. On the screen, grainy black and white film flickered to life. The footage was old, the edges marked with scratches and imperfections. A sterile room came into view, its walls lined with dull metal panels. The camera's focus was unsteady, the frame adjusting before locking onto a row of children. There were 7 of them, no older than 12. They stood in loose formation, their bodies eerily rigid. Their feet hovered inches above the ground. Their eyes were rolled back, showing only the whites. Their lips moved in unison, forming words that held no sound. Michael watched as their mouths shaped the same phrase over and over, an incantation without a voice. His attention caught on the girl at the center. Her head tilted back slightly, her mouth open wider than the others. Something about her expression made his stomach tighten. A look caught between pain and revelation. A soft knock broke the silence. Michael's head snapped toward the door. He hadn't heard footsteps outside. The knock came again, later this time, almost hesitant. His hand instinctively moved toward the gun at his hip. He rose carefully, crossing the room without making a sound. The peephole offered only an empty walkway, the neon light outside painting the ground in streaks of red and orange. He hesitated. Another knock. This time it came from behind him. Michael turned sharply. There was no second door. The motel room was empty. Then, in the dark, he heard a recognizable whisper, soft and familiar. His own. Part 2. Michael awoke with his mouth dry. The motel room was silent, yet the whisper still clung to the space, lingering like the echo of something that had never been spoken aloud. He turned his head, scanning the dark. The only illumination came from the slivers of neon light slicing through the gaps in the curtains. He sat up slowly, his mind replaying the sound, his own voice murmuring from somewhere deep in the shadows. The words had not been clear, but the cadence was unmistakable. He ran a hand over his face and let out a slow breath, grounding himself. It was exhaustion, it had to be. He'd spent too many hours poring over declassified files, staring at grainy footage of children who should not have been able to do the things they'd done. Sleep deprivation did strange things to the mind, but that didn't explain the knock. He forced himself to stand, checking the door, then the window. There were no signs of disturbance. The parking lot outside was empty, except for his own car and a single truck parked beneath the flickering vacancy sign. A quiet night in a town that barely existed on a map, yet something had been here. His gut told him so, even as his rational mind worked to deny it. The drive to New Mexico was long, the scenery shifting from flat Midwest nothingness to stretches of desert that swallowed the horizon. Rebecca sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone. "You're quiet," she said without looking up. Michael kept his eyes on the road. A long night. She glanced at him, her expression skeptical. Bad dreams or something worse? Michael didn't answer right away. He told her about the film, about the children, their floating bodies, the silent chanting, but he didn't mention the motel, the whisper, the voice that had come from nowhere. "I'm fine," he said instead. "Tell me what you found on the facility." Rebecca let it go, though he could tell she didn't buy it. She tapped her screen. Starlight was never an officially recognized program. It was absorbed into a larger project called Sentinel in the early 80s. But get this, there are no death records for the test subjects. No obituaries, no birth certificates after they entered the system. It's like they stopped existing. Michael tightened his grip on the wheel. Rebecca continued, flipping through her notes. The project was shut down after some kind of incident in 1978. No details, just a vague memo about a containment breach. After that, the record stopped cold. Michael nodded, his jaw set. He'd read similar things in the journal they'd found, words that skirted around the truth but never confirmed it. The children were never terminated, only contained. The facility was nestled in the middle of nowhere, its existence erased from modern maps. The road leading to it had been overtaken by dust and time, the pavement cracking beneath years of neglect. The building itself loomed in the distance, squat and industrial, its faded metal siding barely visible against the barren landscape. They parked a mile out, approaching on foot. The closer they got, the more wrong the place felt. Michael noticed it first, the sensation of being observed, though there were no cameras, no movement beyond the wind stirring in the dust. Rebecca slowed her steps beside him. "Tell me when you feel that." Michael nodded. "We're not alone." The entrance was unmarked, the doors rusted but intact. There were no signs of forced entry, no graffiti or vandalism, only the stillness of abandonment. Michael tested the handle. Unlocked. He exchanged a glance with Rebecca before pushing the door open. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and something acrid that clung to the back of his throat. The first room was an administrative office, the furniture untouched. Papers lay scattered on desks, curling at the edges from years of exposure. A bulletin board on the far wall still held faded memos, notices, stamped with outdated government insignias. Michael's eyes settled on a row of filing cabinets. He tried the nearest drawer. Locked. Rebecca moved ahead, sweeping her flashlight across the space. Doesn't look loaded. If someone shut this place down, they left in a hurry. Michael didn't respond. His attention had shifted to the far end of the room, where a steel door stood slightly ajar. Beyond it, a hallway stretched into darkness. Something about the open door unsettled him. He stepped forward, pushing it wider. Beyond the threshold, the walls bore signs of something older than simple neglect. Faint, hand-shaped smudges trailed along the surface, as if someone or something had been led through the corridor. The prints were small, child-sized. Rebecca stiffened. "Michael." Her voice had lost its usual sharpness. He followed her gaze to a rusted plaque bolted to the wall. Sublevel 1. Containment. Michael swallowed. The word lingered heavy with meaning. Rebecca exhaled, shaking her head. "I don't like this." Michael stepped forward. "Let's find out what they're containing." The scientist's house was deep in the desert, a squat, sun-bleached structure with bars over the windows and a door that looked as though it had been reinforced from the inside. Dr. Walter Henshaw had been declared dead in 1993, but the man who answered their knock was very much alive. His skin was weathered, his hair white. His eyes, though, were sharp, alert in a way that spoke of long years expecting the worst. Michael held up his badge. "Dr. Henshaw, we have some questions about Project Starlight." The man studied them for a long moment before stepping back, motioning them inside. The interior of the house was sparse, cluttered only with stacks of books and piles of documents yellowed with age. The television played static in the corner, though there was no antenna in sight. Henshaw sat heavily in an old armchair, rubbing a hand over his face. "I told them to let it die," he muttered, "to bury it deeper than it already was." Michael took a seat opposite him. "Tell us what happened." Henshaw exhaled. "You think they were just children, don't you? You think we found them, plucked them from orphanages, trained them like weapons?" He shook his head. "That's not the truth. The truth is, they weren't chosen." Rebecca frowned. "Then how were they selected?" Henshaw's expression darkened. "They called us. Every single one of them. We didn't find them. They let us know where they were." Michael felt a chill settle along his spine. What were they? Henshaw looked at him, eyes sunken and tired. Not human, not entirely. We thought we were studying them, but the entire time, we were the ones being observed. Then why lock them away? Rebecca asked. Henshaw's fingers curled against the arm of his chair. Because they weren't speaking to us. They were speaking to something else. And one day, we realized. The lights flickered. Henshaw stopped mid-sentence. His gaze lifted past them toward the doorway. Michael turned, following his line of sight. The hallway beyond the room was empty. But somewhere in the darkness, something whispered. Part 3. The road leading to the Starlight facility had been overtaken by time, swallowed by desert and dust. The remains of the pavement cracked beneath their tires, the worn edges blending seamlessly into the barren landscape. It had been decades since anyone had officially set foot here. Yet, as Michael slowed the car to a stop just outside the rusted chain-link perimeter, he could see the fresh tire tracks cutting through the sand, leading straight to the main entrance. Rebecca was already scanning the area. Someone else has been here recently. Michael nodded, gripping the wheel tighter than he needed to. The facility loomed ahead of them, a squat industrial structure half buried in the landscape. It had been built to last, reinforced against time and the elements, but its windows were long gone, either shattered by the desert winds or something else. They approached on foot, weapons drawn. The front entrance was a heavy steel door, once painted white, but now streaked with rust. A faded government seal remained, the words, "Authorized personnel only," barely legible beneath decades of wear. Michael tested the handle. It turned easily. Rebecca tensed beside him. That shouldn't be possible. Michael pushed the door open. The hinges groaned, but there was no resistance. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the scent of metal, dust, and something harder to define. Something chemical. The lobby had once been an administrative space, but time had worn it down to ruin. Desks sat overturned, chairs missing legs, file cabinets left ajar. Papers littered the floor, curling at the edges, but none had the yellowed fragility of decades-old documents. These were newer. Rebecca crouched beside a pile of them. Someone was going through this stuff recently. Michael swept his flashlight across the room, his gaze settling on a set of double doors marked Lab Access, Level 1. The doors were slightly ajar. Beyond them, a hallway stretched into darkness. "We checked the offices first," he said. "If someone's been here, they might have left something behind." Rebecca didn't argue. They moved carefully through the space, their footsteps muffled against the dust-caked floor. The offices had been left in disarray, but nothing about it suggested vandalism or looting. Files had been removed from their drawers with precision, not carelessness. Whoever had been here before them hadn't come for destruction. They'd come for something specific. Michael's attention caught on a desk near the back of the room. A yellowed folder sat open, its contents spread haphazardly. He lifted the top page. Subject 3, Speech Patterns, was scrawled across the top. The report detailed an incident from 1975 in which Subject 3, a 10-year-old girl, had begun speaking in a language no one could identify. Further notes indicated that language had been analyzed by experts, cross-referenced against every known dialect, ancient and modern. No matches. He flipped to the last page, where a handwritten note had been scrawled in hurried script. They're not learning it, they're remembering it. A sound echoed from deeper within the facility. Michael's head snapped up. The noise had been distant, a metallic scrape against concrete, like something shifting in the dark. Rebecca heard it too. She reached for her sidearm, her expression tight. "We're not alone." Michael placed the folder back on the desk and motioned toward the hallway. Let's move. The deeper they went, the worse it became. The first sign was the electricity. Despite being abandoned for decades, the facility still had power. Some of the overhead lights flickered weakly, buzzing with the hum of old wiring. Others remained entirely dark, leaving long stretches of the corridor swallowed in shadow. Then there were footsteps. The dust on the floor was thick, undisturbed in most places, but here and there, footprints broke the pattern. Some were fresh, heavy boot treads leading toward the lower levels. Others were smaller, fainter, as though they'd been left long ago but never fully faded, child-sized. Rebecca knelt beside one, brushing a gloved hand over it. These shouldn't still be here. If these were made in the 70s, they would have been covered up by now. The facility had been sealed for decades. The only people who should have been here recently were adults. These prints were different. Rebecca stood, dusting off her hands. The lower levels are where they kept the test subjects. Michael nodded. Let's find a way down. The elevator was long dead, but the stairwell was still intact. The concrete steps spiraled downward, the air growing colder with each level they descended. Faint warning signs remained bolted to the walls. Level B1, containment access. Level B2, research and monitoring. Level B3, termination facility. The last sign had been scratched through, deep gouges carved into the metal. At the bottom of the stairwell, a steel door waited. A government-issued warning was painted across its surface in bold white letters. Level B3, never open. The words were underlined twice, the paint chipped but still stark against the corroded metal. Rebecca ran a hand over the lettering. Never open. Michael reached for the welding seams. The door had been sealed shut long ago, multiple layers of steel melted over the edges to prevent it from ever moving again. Someone had cut through them. The welding had been spliced open, the seams broken. The door stood slightly ajar. Michael exhaled. They already opened it. Rebecca hesitated. We don't have to go in. Michael met her gaze. You really believe that? And she didn't answer. With a deep breath, they stepped inside. The chamber was massive, far larger than the facility's exterior had suggested. Thick observation glass lined one side of the room, its surface clouded with age and dust. Monitoring stations sat along the perimeter, their screens dark but intact. At the center of the room, suspended in midair, were the children. 7 of them, their bodies unchanged from the film reels. They hovered inches above the ground, their eyes open but unseeing. Their lips moved in unison, forming silent words. They should have been dead, Michael thought. The film reels had been recorded in the 1970s. Decades had passed. Yet, here they were, exactly as they had been. Rebecca stepped forward. It's like they never left. The overhead lights flickered and the whispering grew louder. Michael's gut twisted. It wasn't coming from the children. The sound was everywhere. The walls, the ceiling, the air itself. A voice, no, voices, whispered in unison, their words spreading through the silence like a current. Michael turned toward the glass, and his reflection was not his own. It was a child, a girl with dark, hollow eyes and a mouth that moved without sound. Behind him, Rebecca inhaled sharply. Then the lights died, and the facility shook. A low siren wailed from deep within the complex, its tone mechanical, almost human. Speakers cracked overhead. A robotic voice broke through the static. Protocol Omega initiated. Release imminent. From the shadows beyond the containment chamber, a man in a suit stepped forward, a government-issued sidearm raised in one steady hand. Director Charles Harlow. "Step away from the chamber," he ordered. "Now." Before Michael could respond, the children turned toward Harlow as one. Their heads moved, but their bodies remained still. Harlow hesitated. His gun trembled. Then blood trickled from his nose, from his ears, from his eyes. He let out a strangled sound, choking on something unseen. His body twisted unnaturally, the snap of bone sharp against the silence. Then, with a final, impossible lurch, he vanished. The sirens screamed louder, the whispering rose, and the children opened their eyes. Part 4. The moment Harlow vanished, the entire chamber shifted, its walls stretching and warping at the edges of Michael's vision. The children hovered in places, their eyes wide and blank, their heads cocked at angles too precise to be natural. Michael took a step back. Rebecca had already drawn her weapon, though they both knew it wouldn't make a difference. A sound, low and deep, not a siren but something beneath it, rumbled through the room. The walls, once solid, had lost their certainty. They were shifting, doors disappearing and reforming, hallways twisting into unfamiliar angles. The structure itself was changing, warping around them. Michael turned toward the exit, but the door they'd entered through was gone. In its place, a corridor stretched into darkness, lined with doors that had not been there moments before. Rebecca exhaled through her nose. "Tell me you're seeing this." Michael nodded, his jaw tight. "Stay close." They moved quickly, skirting the perimeter of the chamber. The whispers had not stopped, but now they came from everywhere, filling the space with voices layered atop one another, speaking words too low to understand. A sharp burst of sound crackled from the intercom above. A recording. A man's voice, shaking and distorted, came through. "Final transmission. Experiment failure. They were never children. They were never ours." Rebecca's grip on her weapon tightened. "Henshaw." Michael recognized the voice, too. It was older, weathered, but unmistakable. The last scientist alive from Project Starlight. The recording continued, a frantic edge creeping into the words. "We thought we were teaching them. We thought we were guiding them, but all we ever did was give them a way in." The whispering stopped, and silence flooded the space. Rebecca went rigid, her head snapping to the side as if she had heard something that wasn't there. Michael saw it too. A door at the far end of the room had cracked open, light spilling from the gap. Not the sterile glow of fluorescence, but something else, warmer and golden. It flickered like candlelight. Michael's gut twisted. Rebecca's expression darkened. "I don't want to go in there." Michael swallowed. "Neither do I." The whispering returned, but this time it wasn't incomprehensible. It was his own voice. "Michael Graves. Michael Graves. Michael Graves." The words curled around him, pressing into his skull from all sides. Rebecca stared at the door, unmoving. Then somewhere inside, she heard a scream. Hers. Not the Rebecca standing next to him, but another. A version of her that was already in the room. Michael grabbed her wrist. "We keep moving." Rebecca hesitated, her face pale, but nodded. They turned away from the door and ran. The facility had changed. The layout no longer followed the map they'd studied. Corridors stretched where there had been none, staircases ending in blank walls. The place was folding in on itself. They moved quickly, taking turns at random, following instinct rather than reason. The whispers tracked their movements, filling the air with half-heard words, pulling them toward places they did not want to go. Then, without warning, the walls opened into another chamber. It was smaller than the first, lined with consoles and inactive monitors. At its center, a single desk sat before a projector screen, a reel already loaded. The label on the film was handwritten. Final transmission. Michael and Rebecca exchanged a look. Without speaking, Michael stepped forward and pressed play. The machine whirred, the reel spun, and the screen flickered to life. The footage was old, its quality grainy, and its edges frayed with time. A man sat at the desk, his face drawn, his eyes hollow. Dr. Walter Henshaw. His hands trembled as he lit a cigarette, taking a slow drag before speaking. "This will be my last recording," he said. His voice was steady, but beneath it, something cracked, something raw and exhausted. "We never should have tried. That's the only thing that matters now. We should have let them stay forgotten." A shudder ran through him. He wiped a shaking hand down his face. "The children, they weren't enhanced," he continued. "They weren't trained. They weren't even human." He exhaled, smoke curling in the dim light. "We thought we were studying them, but all we ever did was make it easier. We built the door, and we gave them the signal." Michael's stomach turned. On camera, Henshaw swallowed hard, his eyes flicking towards something just outside the frame. "I can hear them now. They're not speaking to me anymore. They're speaking to it." Henshaw shuddered and went on. "I don't know what's coming, but I know one thing. They didn't create the signal." Henshaw paused a moment and looked straight at the camera. Then, with finality, he said, "They were answering it." The reel ended. The machine clicked off. The silence that followed was suffocating. Rebecca turned to Michael. "This wasn't about a psychic program." "I'm afraid you're right," Michael said with a nod, his throat dry. "It was about preparation. The facility hadn't been an experiment. It had been a waiting room, and whatever they'd been waiting for was finally arriving." The building trembled. The walls groaned as something shifted deep beneath the floors, something vast and unseen. Michael and Rebecca turned just as the door they had avoided before, the one with the light, opened fully. A girl stood in the doorway. She was small, no older than 10, dressed in the same gray uniform as the children in the footage. Her hair was dark, her skin pale. Around her neck, a thin silver chain glinted with a dim light. A wedding ring dangled from it. The girl smiled. "We are here." The facility shook and the air trembled. Rebecca screamed as something in the shadows moved, stretching toward her with fingers made of darkness. Michael lunged, but the room folded, not physically, but in the way dreams can change shape, shifting reality like liquid. Rebecca vanished. Michael stumbled backward, reaching for her, but his hand grasped nothing. The girl was still watching him, smiling. Behind her, the walls peeled away, revealing something vast and endless. Above them, the ceiling split open and the stars Michael had never seen before, constellations that did not belong, began to realign. The whispering was no longer coming from the children, but from above. Michael turned, running toward the only exit left. He didn't stop until the sky outside swallowed him whole. Part 5. Michael ran. The facility groaned behind him, the sound like steel bending under some immense, unseen force. The desert stretched ahead, its vast emptiness offering no promise of safety. The sky had changed. The stars no longer followed constellations he recognized. They pulsed and swayed, shifting with an unnatural rhythm as though something immense stirred just beyond them. The whispering had not stopped. It grew louder, layered upon itself. The words were foreign, unknowable, yet he understood them. They were not words at all. They were instructions. Michael staggered. The motel, the basement, the film reels. It had all been leading here. It had never been about the children. Not just the children. The experiment had never ended. It had only waited. The wind shifted. The ground beneath him trembled as though something vast had turned its attention toward him. He could feel it now, pressing into him like hands reaching through the fabric of reality. Overhead, a light flared. Something was descending. Michael's knees buckled. His mind rebelled against the sight, his vision splitting between what he saw and what he was meant to see. He saw the desert, the sky, the impossible realignment of the stars, and he saw something else, a shape vast beyond comprehension, coiling through the spaces between what should be. The children had not called it, they had guided it, prepared the way. The experiment had not created them, it had only nurtured them, taught them how to listen, taught them how to answer back. The air split apart with a soundless scream. Michael saw figures moving in the distance, stumbling from the facility, their faces upturned in horror. Scientists, soldiers, people who had remained hidden, waiting for a moment that was never meant to come. It had come anyway. Rebecca was gone. Harlow was gone. Michael didn't know if he was still here. A voice, small and childlike, whispered behind him, "You were always meant to be here." Michael turned. The girl from the footage stood before him. The same girl from the motel, the one who he had seen, reflected in the glass. The wedding ring around her neck glinted softly in the unnatural light. She reached for him. Michael tried to move, to step back, but his body no longer belonged to him. His vision blurred at the edges, the desert dissolving into static. The world shifted, cracking apart at the seams. The whispering stopped. The stars realigned one final time, and then nothing. Months later, the file appeared on a conspiracy forum. It was buried deep, hidden among threads filled with half-truths and speculation. A single attachment, a scanned document stripped of its official classification, and the header read, "Project Starlight, Final Report." The contents were brief. Agent Michael Graves, status unknown, presumed deceased. Official records sealed. The thread gained traction. Users dissected every word, every redacted line, but it was the final attachment that drew the most attention. A photograph, blurry and washed out, as though it had been taken through old film or a corrupted digital file. In it, a girl stood in the center of the frame. Her face was indistinct, her features obscured by motion blur, but something about her eyes, wide, unblinking, made those who saw the image uneasy. Around her neck, a chain hung loosely, holding a small, tarnished object, a ring. A man in the thread claimed to have enhanced the image, sharpening the details, but when he posted the results, the photo was gone. The entire thread was gone, as though it had never existed at all. And that was Project Starlight by Charlotte Morrow, performed by yours truly.
I'll tell you what, Otis, if an experiment was shut down, classified, and erased from history, there's usually a damn good reason why.
That's right. And digging it up again? That's just asking for trouble.
And yet some people just can't help themselves.
No, they can't. But I've got a feeling this next story proves that curiosity is a dangerous thing, especially when the wrong eyes are watching.
This next one? It's not about something buried in the past. It's about something right in front of us. Something that looks innocent, harmless. But when you look too long, well, you might not like what you see staring back. This is the 15-Second Soul Sucker by Craig Groshek, performed by yours truly, Malcolm Blackwood. Part 1. Returning to the Boys and Girls Club after summer break felt like coming home. The familiar echo of kids yelling and laughing, the faint smell of sneakers and disinfectant, and the steady hum of fluorescent lights in the gym. It all grounded me. I'd spent most of my high school years volunteering here, coaching games, helping with homework, and breaking up the occasional dodgeball-related dispute. I loved it. It wasn't just about the kids. It was about the feeling that I was doing something meaningful. Emily, the senior staff member on my shift, greeted me at the front desk with her usual warm smile. She was the glue holding this place together, a no-nonsense type with a knack for handling even the toughest kids. "Glad to have you back, Aubin," she said, handing me my name tag. "We've missed you." "Thanks, Em. Good to be back. How's the summer crew holding up?" Her smile faltered slightly and she lowered her voice. "Not bad, but we've got a new member you should know about. Gregory." "Gregory?" She nodded, glancing toward the game room where a cluster of kids was playing foosball. 8 years old, came in about a month ago, and let's just say he's different. I raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" "He's got some behavioral issues," Emily said, choosing her words carefully. "OCD tendencies, no filter, and an unsettling way of talking. He's been intimidating other kids, threatening violence, refusing to participate in activities, and when he's left unsupervised, he gets up to some serious mischief." "That bad, huh?" Emily leaned in closer. "Just keep an eye on him. And Aubin, don't let him get under your skin. He's a handful." I nodded, filing her warning away. I'd handled tough kids before. How bad could Gregory really be? I met him during cleanup after dodgeball. It had been a chaotic but fun afternoon in the gym, with kids hurling foam balls at each other like miniature gladiators. As the game wound down, I stayed behind to put the equipment away while the rest of the group headed to the cafeteria for snack time. The equipment room was a cramped, windowless space lined with shelves overflowing with balls, jump ropes, and cones. I was halfway through stuffing dodgeballs into a mesh bag when I heard it. "Aubin." The voice came from directly behind me. I spun around so fast that I nearly tripped over a stray basketball. Standing there, barely 2 feet away, was a boy I hadn't noticed before. He was small for his age, with pale skin and a mop of dark hair that looked like it hadn't seen a comb in weeks. His eyes, though, they were sharp, piercing, and far too old for an 8-year-old. He stared at me with an intensity that made my stomach twist. "You're quiet," I said, trying to steady my voice. "Didn't even hear you come in." Gregory didn't respond. He just kept staring, his head tilted slightly to one side, like he was studying me. "Can I help you with something?" I asked, dropping the bag of balls. "You don't know me yet," he said finally. His voice was soft, but carried an unnerving authority. "But you will." I blinked. Okay. I'm Aubin. You must be Gregory." A slow smile crept across his face. "That's right. They've told you about me, haven't they?" "Maybe a little," I admitted, keeping my tone neutral. He took a step closer, closing the already narrow gap between us. I instinctively backed up, bumping into the shelf behind me. "Do you believe in soul-sucking?" he asked, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I stared at him. "Soul-sucking? Like doing a job you hate and feeling drained? That kind of thing?" "No," Gregory said, his tone patient, like he was explaining something obvious to a slow student. "I mean literally sucking someone's soul out of their body." My first instinct was to laugh, but something about his expression stopped me. He wasn't joking. "I don't think that's a real thing," I said carefully. "It is," Gregory replied. "I've done it." My stomach churned. "Why? Why would you do that?" "Because it's fun," he said simply. I swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how alone we were in the cramped room. "Gregory, you shouldn't joke about stuff like that." "Who says I'm joking?" He took another step closer, so close now that I could feel his breath. Want to see how it works? No, I said quickly, my voice shaky. Before I could react, Gregory reached up and grabbed my face with both hands, his fingers cold and firm against my skin. He leaned in, his mouth inches from mine, and inhaled sharply. The sound he made was grotesque, like sucking the last bit of liquid through a straw. And then I felt it, a horrifying, bone-deep sensation of something being pulled from me. My chest tightened, and for a moment, I thought I might vomit. The room spun. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. All I could do was stand there, paralyzed, as the feeling of detachment grew stronger, as if some invisible thread connecting me to the world was being severed. "Hey, what's going on in here?" The voice snapped me back to reality. Emily stood in the doorway, her eyes darting between Gregory and me. Gregory let go of my face and stepped back, eerily calm. "Nothing," he said, his tone light and innocent. "Aubin was just putting the balls away. I came to see if he needed help, but I was just leaving." Emily frowned, but didn't press further. "Aubin, we need you in the cafeteria. Snacks starting." "Yeah," I managed, my voice hoarse. "I'll be right there." Gregory shot me one last glance before walking out. The calm, knowing smile on his face made my skin crawl. I stayed in the equipment room for a few extra minutes, trying to regain my composure. My hands trembled as I touched my face, half expecting to find some physical evidence of what had just happened. But there was nothing. When I finally worked up the courage to leave, the cafeteria was bustling with kids and staff. Gregory sat at a table near the back, munching on a bag of chips like nothing had happened. I didn't approach him. I couldn't. Part 2. The next 3 days felt like an eternity. Gregory's words haunted me. It only takes 15 seconds to suck someone's soul. The sensation of him pulling at something deep inside me was impossible to forget. I tried telling myself it wasn't real, that he was just a creepy kid with a vivid imagination. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the unease. I avoided him at all costs, keeping my distance during activities and sticking to larger groups. It wasn't just for my own sanity. Something about him didn't sit right with the other kids either. They kept away from him without being told, as if they sensed what I had. On my next shift, Emily greeted me with a concerned look. "We're short a few kids today," she said, handing me the attendance sheet. "Looks like there's some kind of bug going around. Half a dozen kids called out sick." "Sick?" I asked, scanning the list. Several of the names were familiar. Henry, Chelsea, Marcus, all kids I'd seen Gregory talking to in the past week. "Yeah, fever, fatigue, all that stuff," Emily replied. "Probably just the flu, but keep an eye on the ones who are here just in case it spreads." I nodded, but my stomach churned. This wasn't the flu. It couldn't be. That afternoon, I couldn't focus on my usual duties. Instead, I found myself watching Gregory from a distance, trying to piece together what he was up to. He moved through the club like a shadow, quiet and calculating. Every so often, he'd zero in on a kid, sitting unnervingly close and whispering in their ear. The kids' reactions were always the same. A look of confusion, then fear, followed by a strange blankness that made my skin crawl. By the time my shift ended, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. After the last of the kids had left and the building was quiet, I made my way to the staff office. It wasn't difficult to find the security camera feed. Emily had shown me the system months ago. I sat at the computer, scrubbing through footage from the past week. At first, it was just routine chaos. Kids running around, staff shouting over the din, games of tag turning into wrestling matches. But then I saw him. Gregory. In clip after clip, he repeated the same chilling pattern. He'd corner a kid in an isolated part of the building, a storage closet, an empty corner of the gym, behind the snack bar. His small hands would grip their face, and his mouth would hover just inches from theirs. And then he'd inhale. Even through the grainy footage, I could see the kids' reactions. Their bodies would go rigid, their eyes wide with terror. Some tried to pull away, but Gregory's grip was unrelenting. The sessions lasted only a few seconds before he let them go, and the kids stumbled away looking dazed and unsteady. My stomach lurched as I realized I was watching the same thing he'd done to me, only with them, it had lasted longer. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about the footage. I needed answers, real ones. I looked up Gregory's address in the staff files and decided to pay a visit. It wasn't hard to rationalize. As a volunteer, I'd visited kids' homes before to drop off forgotten belongings or deliver newsletters. But this time, I wasn't sure what I'd find. Gregory lived in an older neighborhood on the edge of town, where the houses were cramped together like mismatched teeth. The paint on the one I stopped at was peeling, and the lawn was overgrown with weeds. I knocked on the door and waited. It creaked open, and a woman peeked out. She was thin and pale, her hair pulled into a messy bun. Her eyes were bloodshot, like she hadn't slept in days. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Hi," I began, forcing a smile. "I'm Aubin, a volunteer at the Boys and Girls Club. I work with Gregory." "Is he in trouble?" she asked. No, I said quickly. "I just wanted to touch base. He's been acting a little unusual at the center, and I thought it might help to get some context." She stared at me for a moment, then opened the door wider. "Come in." The inside of the house was just as bleak as the outside. The furniture was old and mismatched, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. Gregory's father sat in an armchair by the window, his eyes glued to a muted TV. He didn't look up as I entered. "What do you want to know?" Gregory's mother asked, gesturing for me to sit on the sagging couch. "Well," I began cautiously, "Gregory's a bright kid, but some of his behavior has been concerning. Has he always been this way?" Her lips twitched into something that might have been a smile. "Gregory's special," she said. "He's not like other kids." I waited for her to elaborate, but she didn't. "Special how?" I pressed. She glanced toward her husband, who finally looked up from the TV. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. "He has gifts," the man said, his voice gravelly. "Things other kids don't. You'll see. Everyone does, eventually." My blood ran cold. "What kind of gifts?" Gregory's mother stood abruptly. "I think it's time for you to go." I opened my mouth to argue, but thought better of it. The looks on their faces told me I wasn't going to get any more answers. As I left, I noticed Gregory standing at the top of the stairs, watching me. He didn't say a word, but the look in his eyes sent a shiver down my spine. When I returned to the club that afternoon, Gregory was waiting for me. He cornered me in the locker room, his small frame blocking the door. "You went to my house," he said, his tone flat. "How do you—" "You shouldn't have done that," he interrupted. His eyes bore into mine, unblinking. "Do you know what happens to people who dig too deep?" I swallowed hard. "Gregory, whatever you're doing, you need to stop. You're hurting people." "They're weak," he said with a shrug. "If I don't take their souls, someone else will." My chest tightened. What are you talking about? He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. You can't stop me, Aubin. You're just like the rest of them. Before I could respond, he slipped past me and out the door. Part 3. By the time I arrived at the club for my next shift, Gregory had taken over my thoughts completely. His warning in the locker room echoed in my head. You can't stop me, Aubin. You're just like the rest of them. I didn't know what that meant, but I had a growing sense that it was only going to get worse. Gregory's behaviors escalated quickly. He stopped hiding his manipulations. During group activities, he would interrupt games with cryptic remarks that left the other kids unsettled. You know what it feels like to lose everything? He asked a group during an art session. Like all the light in your head just disappears and you're stuck in the dark forever? The kids exchanged nervous glances, unsure how to respond. One of the staff members, Mr. Torres, stepped in, redirecting the conversation to the activity at hand. But Gregory's words hung in the air like a bad smell. I tried to talk to Emily about it, but she brushed me off. He's just testing boundaries, she said. It's what kids like him do. You've seen it before. This isn't like the others, I said, frustrated. He's dangerous. Emily sighed, clearly unconvinced. If you're that worried, keep an eye on him. But remember, he's just a kid, Aubin. But Gregory wasn't just a kid. He was something else. Something that didn't belong here. I spent hours researching anything that might explain what he was. My internet history became a mess of folklore, supernatural legends, and obscure forums about energy vampires and soul stealers. Most of it sounded ridiculous, but one thread stuck with me. It was about children who could drain the life force of others, leaving them weak, sick, or worse. The thread claimed these kids were born with a kind of gift that allowed them to feed off others' souls to sustain themselves. There was no cure, no way to stop them, only to avoid them at all costs. The more I read, the more the descriptions lined up with Gregory. But avoiding him wasn't an option, not with other kids in danger. 2 days later, Gregory found me again. This time it was in the empty hallway outside the gym. Still spying on me? He asked, leaning casually against the wall. I froze. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. He took a step closer, his dark eyes gleaming with amusement. You think you can stop me? That's funny. I'm not afraid of you, I lied. He grinned. Yes, you are. I can taste it. I clenched my fists, my jaw tightening. You need to stop, Gregory. You're hurting people. So what? He said, shrugging. They're just kids. Weak ones. If I don't take their souls, someone else will. My stomach churned. What does that even mean? You wouldn't understand, he said, stepping closer until we were nearly nose to nose. But don't worry, Aubin. I'll show you one day. Before I could respond, he was gone, leaving me shaking and furious. That afternoon, the club held an art activity in the cafeteria. The kids were busy drawing and painting, the room buzzing with chatter. Gregory sat at a table near the back, scribbling on a piece of paper. I kept a close eye on him, my nerves on edge. Then it happened. One of the younger kids, a timid boy named Liam, asked Gregory if he could borrow a red crayon. Gregory ignored him at first, but when Liam asked again, Gregory snapped. No, he said coldly. It's just a crayon, Liam said, confused. Gregory stood up slowly, reaching into his backpack. When his hand came out, he was holding a knife. The room froze. "Gregory, put that down," Emily shouted, stepping forward. Gregory's expression didn't change. He held the knife tightly, his gaze fixed on Liam. The staff scrambled into action, initiating a lockdown. Kids were ushered into nearby rooms, the doors locked behind them. But Gregory didn't move. He stayed in the center of the cafeteria, the knife glinting in his hand. As the staff tried to contain the situation, Gregory turned his attention to the few stragglers who hadn't been ushered out. The first victim was Mr. Torres. Gregory lunged at him, gripping his face with one hand while holding the knife in the other. "Stop!" I shouted, but it was too late. Gregory inhaled deeply, the sound sickeningly familiar. Mr. Torres froze, his body trembling as Gregory drained him. When Gregory let go, Torres crumpled to the floor, his eyes vacant. The other kids screamed, but Gregory didn't stop. He moved methodically, targeting anyone within reach. By the time I worked up the courage to act, he'd already drained 3 more kids and the interim director. I couldn't let it continue. I grabbed the nearest weapon I could find, a broom handle, and ran toward Gregory. "Gregory!" I shouted. He turned to face me, his lips curling into a smile. "Your turn, Aubin." We clashed in the middle of the gym, the broom handle colliding with the knife. He was fast, impossibly fast, but I managed to knock the weapon out of his hand. We fell to the ground, grappling for control. His hands found my face, and I felt the familiar, horrifying pull as he began to suck at my soul. "Stop!" I gasped, trying to push him off. "You can't stop me," he whispered, his grip tightening. "No one can." My vision blurred. The world around me seemed to fade as the seconds ticked by. I knew I had only one chance. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I grabbed the knife and plunged it into Gregory's chest. He gasped, his grip loosening. For a moment, he just stared at me. Then, he collapsed, his body going limp. Part 4. The gym was silent except for the ragged sound of my breathing and the faint scuff of shoes against the floor as kids peeked out from their hiding spots. Gregory lay sprawled on the ground, the knife still embedded in his chest. My hands trembled as I stared at him, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But he didn't move. I didn't know how long I stood there, frozen. My heart was pounding so loudly that I could barely hear the shouts from the staff members rushing into the gym. "Aubin?" Emily's voice broke through my daze. She ran to me, her eyes wide with panic. "What happened?" I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I gestured weakly toward Gregory's body. Emily knelt beside him, checking for a pulse. Her face paled as she leaned back, shaking her head. "He's gone," she said quietly. The rest of the staff began ushering the kids out of the gym, shielding their eyes from the scene. I sank to the floor, my back against the wall, as the weight of what had just happened crashed down on me. I'd killed him, an 8-year-old boy. But he wasn't just a boy. He was something else, something monstrous. Still, the guilt clawed at me, mixing with the relief that it was finally over. Emily sat down next to me, her voice low. "Aubin, are you hurt?" I shook my head. "No, but he almost..." I stopped, unable to finish the sentence. She didn't press me. By the time the paramedics arrived, the adrenaline had worn off, and I felt like a hollow shell. They loaded me onto a stretcher, insisting on taking me to the hospital to make sure I was okay. The ride was a blur. I drifted in and out of consciousness, the events replaying in my mind like a broken record. Gregory's voice, his grin, the terrifying pull as he sucked at my soul. It all felt too real, too vivid. At one point, I opened my eyes to see a paramedic leaning over me. "You're going to be okay," he said, but I wasn't sure I believed him. At the hospital, I was poked and prodded, my vitals checked, my injuries catalogued. A police officer arrived not long after, his expression serious but not unkind. "Can you tell me what happened?" he asked, pulling up a chair beside my bed. I hesitated, unsure how to explain something so unbelievable. "There was an incident at the club," I said finally. "One of the kids had a knife. He attacked staff and other kids. I paused, swallowing hard. I stopped him." The officer nodded, jotting down notes. "And the knife, it was his?" "Yes," I said. "Were you in immediate danger?" "Yes," I repeated, my voice firmer this time. He grabbed me. I thought he was going to kill me." The officer studied me for a moment before nodding again. "It sounds like self-defense. We'll follow up with the staff and review the security footage, but for now, you're not in any trouble." His words should have been reassuring, but they weren't. Nothing about this situation felt right. After the police left, I lay in the hospital bed staring at the ceiling. The room felt too bright, too sterile, and I couldn't shake the sensation that something was missing. I tried to tell myself it was just the trauma, the shock of what had happened. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Gregory had gotten too close. My soul felt off, incomplete, like a part of me was still trapped in that gym with him. A few days later, I returned to the Boys and Girls Club to collect my things. The building felt different, quieter, emptier. The staff greeted me warmly, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. Emily pulled me aside as I packed up my locker. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "I feel strange, like I'm not all here." She frowned. "That's normal after something like this. It'll take time, Aubin, but you'll heal." I nodded, but her words didn't comfort me. That night, I sat in my room staring at my reflection in the mirror. The face looking back at me felt unfamiliar, like a stranger. I touched my cheek, half expecting to feel Gregory's cold hands again. The memory of his voice echoed in my mind. "You're just like the rest of them." I wondered if he was right, if part of me had been taken that day in the gym, if I'd ever feel whole again. And then a darker thought crept in. What if Gregory wasn't the only one? Part 5. The club never reopened, at least not while I was around to see it. Officially, it was labeled a tragedy. A boy with undiagnosed psychological issues had a breakdown, leading to chaos and loss. The news covered it for a day or two, but it didn't make the national headlines. Just another story about a troubled kid in a quiet town. But I knew the truth. I was discharged from the hospital 2 days later. The doctors told me I was physically fine. No fractures, no lasting injuries, just a mild concussion. But the scans couldn't show what I felt inside. My parents were waiting for me in the lobby, their faces etched with worry. They asked questions I didn't have the energy to answer. I mumbled reassurances, but the truth was, I didn't feel okay. I wasn't sure if I ever would. The police officially closed the case a week later. They reviewed the security footage and corroborated everything I said. Gregory had threatened others with a weapon, attacked multiple people, and left me no choice but to defend myself. "It's a clear case of self-defense," Officer Michaels told me during our last meeting. "You did what you had to do." I nodded, but his words didn't bring the relief they were meant to. The days blurred together after that. I went through the motions, eating, sleeping, answering my parents when they spoke to me, but everything felt off. Colors seemed duller, sounds were muted, and every time I looked in the mirror, I felt a strange disconnect, as if the person staring back at me wasn't really me. I told myself it was just trauma, my mind's way of coping with what had happened. But deep down, I knew better. It wasn't just psychological. Something was missing, something fundamental. I could feel it in the quiet moments when the world slowed down and my thoughts became too loud. It was like a piece of me had been ripped away, leaving behind an empty space that nothing could fill. Sometimes, late at night, I'd wake up gasping for air, convinced I could still feel Gregory's hands on my face, his breath pulling at my very essence. I'd stumble to the bathroom, splash water on my face, and stare at my reflection, searching for some sign of what he'd taken from me. But there was nothing, just my own hollow eyes staring back. As the weeks went on, a new fear began to take root. I thought about the things his parents had said, the way they dismissed my concerns so easily. They'd called him special, as if his abilities were something to be proud of. What if there were others like him, other special people hiding in plain sight? The thought kept me up at night, my mind spiraling into worst-case scenarios. How many souls had Gregory taken before I stopped him? How many more were out there, doing the same thing to others? And what about me? Gregory had come dangerously close to finishing the job. I kept replaying those final moments in my head, counting the seconds as he drained me. 10, 11, 12. He'd been so close. Had I lost more than I realized? One night, unable to sleep, I found myself standing in front of the mirror again. I stared at my reflection, trying to convince myself that I was whole, that I was still me. But the longer I looked, the more I doubted. My face seemed wrong, too pale, too hollow. My eyes didn't sparkle the way they used to. I felt like a ghost haunting my own body. I pressed my hand to the glass, half expecting my reflection to move independently, but it didn't. "Is this all that's left of me?" I whispered to the empty room. The mirror didn't answer. I've tried to move on. I've tried to tell myself that it's over, that Gregory is gone and can't hurt anyone else. But some nights, I wake up with a start, my chest tight and my head spinning. In those moments, I swear I can hear his voice, faint and taunting. "You're just like the rest of them." I don't know what he meant by that. Maybe I never will. All I know is that ever since that day in the gym, the world hasn't felt real. And neither have I. And that was The 15-Second Soul Sucker by Craig Groshek, performed by yours truly.
Malcolm, I don't think I've ever been so glad that I don't spend much time around children.
Yeah, something tells me that's for the best. Gregory, he's the kind of nightmare that just keeps getting worse the more you think about him.
And the worst part? No one sees it coming.
This is why I do everything I can to make sure I'm the one doing the sneaking, Otis.
Charming, Malcolm. But not everything's that scary as hell and operates in the shadows, as we'll soon find out. Our next tale takes us to a small town where something impossible happens, something that shouldn't be able to happen. When the sun betrays you, how can you trust anything else? This is The Sun Blinked by Craig Groshek, performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. Part 1. Michael Thompson's morning routine hadn't changed in years. The familiar buzz of his alarm clock pulled him from sleep at 6:30 sharp. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, taking a moment to stretch, as sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of the bedroom. The warmth of the golden rays was comforting and predictable. Reliable. Sarah was already up, her soft humming drifting in from the kitchen downstairs. The sound of a knife rhythmically hitting the cutting board confirmed she was preparing sandwiches for the kids' lunches. Michael smiled to himself. Ever the overachiever, she didn't just make ham and cheese sandwiches. She packed snacks, notes, and little surprises to brighten Alaric and Elowen's day. He shuffled downstairs, greeted by the smell of fresh coffee and toast. Sarah glanced up from her work, her honey-brown hair tied back in a loose ponytail. "Morning, sleepyhead," she teased, handing him a mug. "Morning," Michael replied, taking a sip. The warmth traveled through his body, jolting him awake. He leaned over to kiss her cheek. "What's on the agenda today?" Same old," she said, slicing an apple into neat wedges. "Parent-teacher conferences this afternoon, and I promised to bake cookies for the fundraiser tomorrow." She sighed. "I swear, sometimes I think I'm busier than the students." Michael chuckled. "You're practically running the school." "Someone has to," she said, smiling, though faint lines of worry creased her face. Alaric bounded down the stairs next, his wiry frame carrying more energy than a 12-year-old should have at this hour. His brown hair stuck up at odd angles, and his glasses were perched precariously on the tip of his nose. He clutched a tattered astronomy book in one hand and a notebook in the other. "Did you know," he began without preamble, "that the sun loses about 4 billion tons of mass every second? That's what keeps it shining." "Good morning to you too," Michael said, ruffling his son's hair. "How about breakfast before that astronomy lesson?" Alaric grinned, sliding into his seat at the table. "It's just cool, that's all. Without the sun, we'd all freeze in minutes." "Charming thought," Sarah said, setting a plate of eggs in front of him. "Now, eat." Elowen appeared at the bottom of the stairs, rubbing her eyes. At 8 years old, she was the opposite of her brother, quiet, observant, and rarely in a rush. Her chestnut hair fell in waves over her shoulders, and she carried a sketch pad under her arm like a security blanket. "Good morning, Ellie," Michael said, using her nickname. She offered a sleepy smile and sat down next to Alaric, opening her pad to reveal a colorful drawing of the sunrise. "I drew this yesterday," she said softly. "It's how the sun looked when we went hiking last weekend." "It's beautiful," Sarah said, leaning down to kiss the top of her daughter's head. The scene felt idyllic, just another ordinary day in Plainville. The small Wisconsin town was predictable as its residents. Neighbors waved from their porches, kids rode bikes down tree-lined streets, and the most exciting news was usually about high school sports. Michael left for work shortly after breakfast, driving past the familiar sights of Plainville. The bakery with its hand-painted sign, the hardware store owned by Rick Torres, and the elementary school where Sarah taught. His job at the local manufacturing plant was steady and unremarkable, but it paid the bills. By noon, he was buried in spreadsheets and only halfway through his second coffee. That evening, the family gathered in the living room, the kids sprawled on the floor with their respective hobbies, Alaric flipping through an astronomy magazine, and Elowen sketching quietly. Michael flipped through channels, settling on a nature documentary narrated in a soothing British accent. "Dad," Alaric said, looking up, "do you think the sun will ever run out of energy?" Michael glanced at his son, caught off guard by the question. "Not in our lifetime, buddy. The sun's got billions of years left." "Good," Alaric said, returning to his magazine, "because without it, everything would die." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Can we not talk about death during family time?" Sorry," Alaric mumbled, though he didn't seem particularly sorry. Michael exchanged a knowing glance with Sarah, who shook her head with a small smile. They both knew Aleric's curiosity was uncontainable. As the evening wore on, the familiar routine of bedtime began. Michael tucked his kids in, kissed Sarah goodnight, and settled into bed with a book. Everything felt normal. Comforting. Part 2. The next day began much like any other. Michael woke early, ate a rushed breakfast, and headed off to work. The kids were groggy but cooperative as Sarah ushered them out the door for school. The weather was clear and crisp, the early October sun warming the air just enough to make the morning pleasant. At 10:17, the sun disappeared. Michael was in the middle of a conversation with a coworker when it happened. One moment, daylight poured through the factory's tall windows. The next, there was absolute darkness. The overhead lights, powered by the plant's generators, flickered briefly before stabilizing. Michael froze, blinking several times as if his eyes had betrayed him. Around him, the murmurs of confusion grew louder. Someone dropped a wrench, the clang reverberating into silence. "Did the power go out?" a voice called. "No," someone else replied. "The machines are still running." Michael stepped toward the window and pressed his hand against the glass. Outside, the world was pitch black. Not the soft dimness of an overcast sky or the hazy twilight of an eclipse. This was total and impenetrable darkness. Then, just as suddenly as it had vanished, the sun reappeared. By noon, the entire town was buzzing with confusion and speculation. At the grocery store, customers stood frozen in the aisles, whispering about the event. At school, teachers huddled in the staff lounge, trying to make sense of what had happened. The phones at City Hall rang non-stop, overwhelmed by calls from concerned residents. Michael returned home that evening to find Sarah pacing the living room. The news was on, but the anchors had little concrete information to share. "They're calling it a solar anomaly," she said, her voice tight. "NASA's saying the sun didn't stop shining. It was just gone." "Gone?" Michael said, frowning. "Not blocked, not dim. It just gone for exactly 1 second." Michael sat on the couch, running a hand through his hair. "Did they say why?" Sarah shook her head. "They don't know." The kids joined them shortly after dinner. Alaric had heard about the event from his science teacher and was full of questions. "Why didn't we freeze?" he asked, eyes wide with curiosity. "The effects would take a little time to reach us," Michael explained. "The sun's light and heat take about 8 minutes to get here. A 1-second blackout wouldn't change much." "But what if it happens again?" Alaric pressed. Michael hesitated, glancing at Sarah. "Let's hope it doesn't," he said finally. Elowen sat quietly, hugging her knees to her chest. "It was scary," she said softly. Sarah wrapped an arm around her. "I know, sweetheart, but we're safe now." The next day, news outlets continued to report on the phenomenon. Footage from around the globe showed the sun sinking out in unison, leaving cities, towns, and rural areas alike in total darkness. Traffic accidents spiked as drivers were caught off guard. Planes reported brief but harrowing moments of disorientation. Scientists appeared on television to assure the public there was no immediate danger. They pointed to data suggesting the sun's fusion reactions were stable and unaffected. Some speculated it was a unique cosmic event, like a massive solar flare or gravitational anomaly. But the lack of answers only fueled public panic. Social media exploded with theories ranging from the plausible to the absurd. One trending post suggested aliens had briefly stolen the sun to study it. Another claimed the blink was a divine warning of the apocalypse. In Plainville, the reaction was more subdued. Neighbors exchanged stories about where they were when the sun vanished, their voices tinged with unease. At church on Sunday, the pastor offered comfort, assuring the congregation that God's plan was unshaken. Back at home, Alaric had taken to studying the sun, with a determination that bordered on obsession. He set up his telescope in the backyard and recorded his observations in a notebook. "Dad," he said one evening, "what if the sun's broken?" Michael looked up from his book, startled. "Broken? Like, what if something happened inside it, something we can't fix?" Michael placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "The sun is massive, buddy. It's been burning for billions of years, and will keep burning for billions more. Whatever happened, I'm sure scientists will figure it out." But Alaric wasn't convinced. His normally cheerful demeanor was replaced with quiet focus. Elwyn, too, seemed changed. Her drawings were darker now, shadows stretched across the page, and the sun often appeared as a faint, distant orb. "Do you think it'll happen again?" Sarah asked Michael late one night as they lay in bed. "I don't know," he admitted, "but if it does, we'll be ready." She reached for his hand, holding it tightly. "We have to be." Part 3. 4 days after the first blink, Michael stood in the backyard watching Alaric adjust the small telescope he meticulously set up on a folding table. His son's focus was unwavering as he tracked the sky, jotting down notes in his weathered notebook. "Anything interesting up there?" Michael asked, trying to keep his tone light. "Not yet," Alaric replied, not looking up, "but I'm watching." Michael admired the boy's determination, but couldn't shake the gnawing feeling of unease that had settled over their family. The first blink was unnerving, but the days since had been eerily normal, as though the event had been some bizarre fluke. Yet the tension in the air, the way people moved, spoke, and even looked at each other, suggested that no one truly believed it was over. That night, as the family sat down for dinner, the sun blinked again. This time it was different. The room plunged into darkness for an instant, then the light returned in 3 rapid bursts. Before anyone could react, the sun disappeared entirely for what felt like an eternity but was, in reality, 30 seconds. Elwyn screamed, dropping her fork as Sarah leapt to her feet and ran to her. Michael bolted to the light switch out of instinct, but the bulb flickered uselessly. "Dad!" Alaric's voice cut through the panic. "I'm here," Michael shouted back, groping for the flashlight they kept in the kitchen drawer. By the time he found it and clicked it on, the sun had returned. The room flooded with light again, but everything felt wrong. Michael checked the thermostat. It had dropped 5 degrees in less than a minute. Outside, the frost on the grass sparkled in the sunlight, an unnatural reminder of what they'd just endured. The news came swiftly this time as the world had been on edge, waiting for the next anomaly. Scientists explained the delay. The light and heat from the sun take 8 minutes to reach Earth. The blackout's effects were only just beginning. Within the hour, reports of frost covering cars and roads flooded in from temperate regions. Wildlife behaved erratically. Birds circled aimlessly in the sky while nocturnal animals emerged into the daylight, seemingly disoriented. Traffic accidents spiked once more as drivers struggled to adjust to the sudden changes in light. Social media filled with videos of bizarre occurrences. Pigeons crashing into windows, fish leaping from icy lakes, and deer standing frozen in the middle of highways. But the most alarming reports came from hospitals, where emergency rooms overflowed with patients injured in panicked accidents or suffering from hypothermia. Michael spent the rest of the evening securing the house. The blackout had rattled him, and the dipping temperature made him worry about the family's ability to stay warm if the phenomenon worsened. He dragged their old camping gear out of the attic, checking the propane tank for a portable heater and testing their battery-powered lanterns. "What are you doing, Dad?" Alaric asked, standing in the doorway with his notebook tucked under his arm. "Making sure we're ready," Michael replied. Alaric hesitated. "You think it's going to happen again, don't you?" Michael straightened, meeting his son's gaze. "I don't know, but if it does, we'll be ready." Alaric nodded, his brow furrowed. "I'll keep watching the sun." Good idea, Michael said, patting his shoulder. But try to get some sleep, too. 2 days later, the sun disappeared for a full minute. Michael and Sarah were in the living room drinking coffee and watching the morning news when the room darkened. They didn't need to check the clock. This time they knew exactly what was happening. Stay calm, Michael said, rising to his feet. Sarah nodded, but her grip on her coffee mug tightened. The children were upstairs, and Michael sprinted to their rooms, flashlight in hand. He found Alaric sitting at the window, staring out at the darkened sky. Elwyn was curled up on her bed, clutching her sketch pad. It's okay, Michael said, his voice steady. It'll come back soon. And it did. But the minute of darkness had felt like an eternity. By the time the light returned, the temperature had plummeted again, and the frost outside had thickened into a silvery sheen. Birds froze mid-flight and fell like stones. Their bodies, littering yards and sidewalks, fresh water, lakes, began to crust over with thin layers of ice. News reports confirmed widespread fatalities from exposure. Farmers mourned livestock that had frozen in their fields. Michael and Sarah did everything they could to keep their children safe. They stuffed blankets along the windowsills to block out the cold drafts, moved the kids' mattresses into the living room near the fireplace, and rationed their remaining propane for the heater. We need more supplies, Sarah said one night, as they huddled together under layers of blankets. I'll go tomorrow, Michael said. The next morning he ventured into town to find chaos. Grocery store shelves were stripped bare, and desperate residents argued over the few remaining supplies. On his way home, he passed Rick Torres's house and noticed a man standing in his front yard, shouting into a megaphone about the end times. A crude wooden cross leaned against the mailbox, surrounded by candles and handwritten signs proclaiming, "Repent now." Michael shook his head and drove on. At home, the family adapted to the grim reality. Alaric spent hours observing the sun through his telescope, scribbling notes about its patterns and brightness. Do you think it's sick? He asked Michael one night. Sick? Like, what if something's wrong with it? Like when a person gets sick and stops working, right? Michael didn't know how to answer. The truth was, he'd started to wonder the same thing. Elwyn, meanwhile, had retreated into her art. She filled page after page with haunting images, shadowy figures standing under a black sky, the sun flickering like a dying light bulb. Michael tried to reassure her, but her solemn gaze told him she wasn't convinced. Part 4. In the days following the third blackout, the world settled into tenuous calm. The sun had returned to shining steadily, its rays warming the frostbitten landscape, but the damage was done. No one believed the phenomenon was over. Fear loomed like an unspoken presence, woven into every conversation, every action, and every strained breath. In Plainville, life moved cautiously. People ventured out to assess the damage and restock dwindling supplies, but the town's usual neighborly warmth was gone. Conversations at the hardware store or the grocery aisle were short, clipped, and tinged with paranoia. The unspoken question hung in the air. When will it happen again? At home, Michael worked tirelessly to prepare for the next blackout. He spent hours fortifying their small house, adding layers of insulation to the windows, sealing gaps in the walls with duct tape. The fireplace became the centerpiece of their survival plan, and Michael scoured the woods near their property for extra firewood, returning with armfuls of frozen branches. We should have enough fuel for a few more days, he said one evening, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. Sarah nodded, her focus elsewhere. She was knitting scarves and mittens for the kids, using old yarn she found in the attic. Her hands moved with mechanical precision, her eyes distant. Sarah, Michael said gently, you okay? She paused, her hand still for the first time in hours. I don't know, she admitted. I just keep thinking about the kids. What if... Stop, Michael interrupted, his tone firm but kind. We can't go down that road. We're doing everything we can. That has to be enough. Sarah swallowed hard and nodded, returning to her knitting. Alaric's obsession with the sun had reached new heights. He spent every spare moment in the backyard with his telescope, tracking the sky and scribbling notes in his battered notebook. I think it's happening to other stars, too, he announced one evening at dinner. Michael and Sarah exchanged a glance. What do you mean? Michael asked. I've been watching the night sky, Alaric explained, pushing his glasses up his nose. Some of the stars, they're blinking. Not like blinking because of the atmosphere. It's different. Michael frowned. Are you sure? Yeah, I've been keeping track. He held up his notebook, filled with tiny, meticulous handwriting and crude star charts. Before Michael could respond, a breaking news alert flashed on the TV. The family turned to the screen as a grim-faced anchor delivered the latest update. Scientists at NASA and observatories worldwide have confirmed an alarming pattern of star blinking across the galaxy, she said. This phenomenon, initially thought to be localized to our sun, appears to be accelerating. Stars in distant systems are vanishing for hours, even days, before reappearing. Experts believe the cause may be a quantum anomaly, disrupting the very fabric of reality. The broadcast cut to a press conference at NASA, where a pale scientist addressed the camera. We're observing a wave-like pattern, he explained. The stars are disappearing sequentially, moving closer to our solar system. Based on our calculations, the next major event will affect Earth in approximately 3 days. We expect a prolonged blackout lasting several days. Panic ripped across the globe. Social media erupted with hashtags like #FinalBlackout and #PrepareNow as people scrambled to share survival tips and conspiracy theories. Markets collapsed entirely and banks shut down as customers withdrew every last penny. In Plainville, the fear was palpable. Michael noticed more boarded-up windows and empty shelves at the grocery store. The streets grew quieter, the sense of community eroding with each passing hour. Rick Torres, the town's resident doomsayer, had gained a small following. Michael spotted him in the church parking lot, preaching to a huddled group of townfolk. His voice echoed through a megaphone. "This is judgment," Rick declared, his voice rising with fervor. "The sins of mankind have brought this upon us. Repent now, and you may yet be saved." Michael shook his head and kept walking. Back at home, the Thompsons worked as a unit to prepare. "Alaric," Michael said, "I want you to double-check our supply list. Food, water, batteries, firewood. Make sure we've got everything." "Yes, sir," Alaric said, saluting before grabbing his notebook. "Elowyn," Sarah said, kneeling beside her daughter, "can you help me gather all the blankets and towels? We need to block the windows and doors again." Elowyn nodded silently and shuffled off to her room. The precautions consumed their days. Michael drove to the edge of town, hoping to scavenge supplies from abandoned buildings. He found a few cans of food and a dusty propane tank, but the pickings were slim. When he returned, he found Sarah teaching the kids how to start a fire without matches. Elowyn watched intently, her small hands clutching a piece of flint. Alaric, meanwhile, was sketching diagrams of the sun, labeling them with terms Michael didn't fully understand. On the second night after the NASA announcement, the family sat around the fireplace, wrapped in blankets. The room was dimly lit by the flickering flames and a single lantern. "You think the sun will come back after this one?" Elowyn asked. Michael hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I think so," he said finally. "The sun has been with us for billions of years. It's not going to give up on us now." Elowyn seemed unconvinced, but nodded anyway. "I've been thinking," Alaric said, breaking the silence. "If this is happening to other stars, does that mean the universe is broken? Like, what if it keeps spreading?" Michael didn't have an answer for that either. He reached out and ruffled his son's hair. Let's focus on what we control, he said. As the predicted blackout approached, the atmosphere in Plainville grew tense. Some families packed up and left, hoping to find safety in larger cities or government shelters. Others barricaded themselves in their homes, unwilling to risk the chaos outside. Michael decided they would stay. We're safer here, he told Sarah. We know this place, and we've got everything we need. The night before the blackout, the family sat together in the living room, eating what might be their last hot meal for days. Sarah had prepared a simple stew over the fireplace, and the aroma filled the room with a fleeting sense of normalcy. We'll get through this, Michael said, looking at each of them in turn. Together. They all nodded, and though the fear in their eyes betrayed their attempts at bravery. Part 5. The day of the predicted blackout arrived with a sense of inevitability. The morning sky was a pale, cold blue, but there was no warmth in its light. Plainville was eerily quiet. Few cars passed on the roads, and the air carried the weight of unspoken fears. Michael stood by the window, staring at the sun as it hovered just above the treetops. It seemed so normal, so steady, that he almost believed the predictions were wrong. Almost. Michael, Sarah called from the kitchen, can you help me with this? He turned to find her struggling to secure the last of the blankets over the kitchen window. They had already covered most of the house, creating a cocoon of insulation to trap whatever warmth they could. He grabbed the duct tape and helped her seal the edges. How are the kids? She asked. Quiet, he said. Alaric still working on his notes. Elowen's drawing again. Sarah nodded, her expression grim. Do you think we'll be okay? Michael met her eyes, wanting to offer certainty, but knowing he couldn't. We'll do everything we can, he said. By late afternoon, the sky began to change. The sun flickered briefly, subtly, like a dying light bulb. Michael noticed it first, pointing it out to Sarah as they gathered the kids in the living room. Is it starting? Alaric asked, his voice trembling with both fear and fascination. I think so, Michael said, his gaze fixed on the window. The sun flickered again, this time more pronounced. It blinked rapidly, 5 or 6 times in quick succession, before disappearing altogether. The darkness was instant and absolute. In the first hours of the blackout, Michael kept the family huddled near the fireplace. Despite their preparations, the cold crept in quickly, seeping through the blankets and layers of clothing. Sarah heated a simple soup over the fire, trying to distract the kids. The TV flickered briefly to life, running on battery power, and displayed a NASA briefing, replayed by a local news station. The scientist speaking looked haggard, his shirt wrinkled and his tie loosened. Preliminary data suggests the sun's disappearance has caused measurable shifts in our solar system's gravitational balance, he explained, his voice tense. The outer planets, Neptune, Uranus, appear to be moving further away from the sun. If this continues, the long-term stability of their orbits could be jeopardized. The broadcast cut to a graphic showing distorted planetary orbits, with faint lines indicating where the planet should be. What does that mean? Alaric asked, his voice trembling. It means things are getting worse, Michael muttered. The broadcast continued, with the scientist warning of cascading effects. Without the sun's gravitational pull, even minor shifts could destabilize the system over time. Earth remains in its orbit for now, but prolonged blackouts could lead to significant drift. The TV screen went dark as the battery died, leaving the room in silence. The first night was brutal. Despite their efforts, the house grew unbearably cold, frost creeping along the edges of the windows. The fire struggled to keep up, its warmth barely reaching beyond the hearth. Michael took stock of their supplies, calculating how long the firewood and propane would last if the blackout stretched longer than expected. The answer wasn't comforting. By the second day, the blackout's effects were catastrophic. Michael ventured outside briefly, bundled in layers, to assess the neighborhood. The snow-crusted streets were deserted. Frost-covered cars sat abandoned in driveways. He spotted a few neighbors peering out from behind their curtains, their faces pale and fearful. At Rick Torres's house, the once bustling scene of his apocalyptic sermons was now eerily empty. The wooden cross lay toppled in the snow, its candles extinguished. As Michael made his way back, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A flock of birds, dozens of them, lay frozen in a heap near the edge of the woods. Their wings were stiff, their bodies encased in frost. By the third day, the temperature inside the house dropped to near freezing. The family burned the last of their firewood, and Michael was forced to make a desperate decision. "I'm going out," he announced. "Michael, no," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We don't have a choice," he replied. "If I don't find more wood or something to burn, we won't make it through another night." He bundled up and stepped into the freezing darkness, carrying a flashlight and an axe. The cold bit at his skin, seeping through his layers. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing an alien world of ice and silence. Michael moved quickly, gathering what he could, fallen branches, pieces of wood from abandoned fences, even Rick Torres's broken cross. He piled everything into his sled and hauled it back to the house, his body screaming from the effort. When he returned, Sarah wrapped her arms around him, and her relief palpable. "Thank God," she whispered. By the fourth day, the family was running on fumes. Their food was nearly gone, and the fire was reduced to embers. The cold had sunk into their bones, and even Alaric's determination was beginning to waver. "Do you think it's ever coming back?" he asked Michael quietly. Michael looked at his son, at his family, and then at the faint glow of the dying fire. "Yes," he said firmly. "It will come back. We just have to hold on." That night, as they huddled together in the living room, the sun finally returned. Part 6. The return of the sun was sudden and blinding. Michael awoke to a soft glow piercing the thick layers of blankets covering the windows. At first he thought it was a dream, but as the light grew brighter, he pulled himself from the cocoon of warmth. He stumbled to the window and peeled back a corner of the covering, letting sunlight flood the room. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "it's back." Her eyes opened slowly, and she sat up, staring at him as if she hadn't heard him correctly. "What?" "The sun," Michael said louder now. "It's back." The children stirred at his words. Alaric was the first to react, leaping from the pile of blankets near the fireplace and racing to the window. "Let me see," he cried. Michael stepped aside, and Alaric pressed his face to the glass, a broad smile spreading across his face. "It's really back," he said, his voice trembling with relief. Elowen followed, clutching her sketch pad. She didn't say anything, but her wide eyes filled with tears as she looked at the golden light bathing the frost-covered yard. Sarah joined them, pulling them all into a tight embrace. For the first time in days, they felt warmth, not just from the sun, but from hope. When Michael ventured outside later that morning, the world was almost unrecognizable. The frost had already begun to melt, leaving behind a landscape marked by devastation. The roads were littered with frozen animals, their bodies thawing in the sunlight. Trees had split from the cold, their branches lying in jagged heaps on the ground. Houses bore the scars of the blackout, cracked windows, collapsed roofs, and makeshift barricades. He walked through the neighborhood, taking in the silence. A few neighbors emerged from their homes, squinting at the bright sky. They nodded at Michael, their expressions a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. At Rick Torres's house, the toppled cross was gone, replaced by a small fire pit surrounded by chairs. Rick sat beside it, staring into the flames. He looked up as Michael approached. "Never thought I'd see the sun again," Rick said, his voice raspy. "Neither did I," Michael replied. Rick gestured to the fire. "You're welcome to join me. We got a bit of food left." Michael shook his head. "Thanks, but I need to get back to my family." Rick nodded, his eyes distant. Take care of them. The news that evening painted a grim but hopeful picture. The blackout had claimed millions of lives worldwide. Cities were devastated, their infrastructures crumbling under the strain of prolonged cold and darkness. Governments had collapsed in some regions while others scrambled to regain control. NASA confirmed that the sun's return was part of a larger pattern. The wave of anomalies affecting the stars seemed to be moving further into the galaxy, leaving Earth temporarily stable. However, the scientists warned that there were no guarantees it wouldn't happen again. Humanity must prepare, one scientist said during a televised briefing. We've learned a hard lesson about our fragility. We must adapt to survive. The report also confirmed worsening gravitational anomalies. The outer planets had shifted further from the sun, and subtle changes in Earth's orbit were detected. These shifts would likely result in long-term climatic changes, though their full impact remained uncertain. At home, the Thompsons began their arduous process of rebuilding their lives. Michael worked to repair the damage to their house, salvaging what he could from the wreckage. He collected firewood, canned goods, and other supplies, determined to be ready for whatever came next. Sarah focused on the children, easing them back into a sense of normalcy. She helped Elowen create new drawings, brighter ones filled with sunlight and warmth. Alaric returned to his telescope, but his obsession with the sun had softened. Instead of tracking its every movement, he began studying the stars, looking for signs of stability in the night sky. One evening, as they sat together around the fireplace, Michael asked, "What did you learn from all this, Alaric?" The boy thought for a moment before answering. "The sun's not as strong as we thought, but neither are we. We need to work together if we want to survive." Michael nodded, a proud smile on his face. "That's a good answer." Weeks passed and the world began to rebuild. Aid organizations distributed food, water, and medical supplies to the hardest-hit areas. Communities banded together, sharing resources and knowledge to create makeshift shelters and repair critical infrastructure. In Plainville, the spirit of resilience was stronger than ever. Neighbors who had once been strangers now worked side by side, repairing homes and clearing debris. Michael and Sarah joined the efforts, teaching their children the importance of community in the face of hardship. One morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, Elowen ran to Michael, clutching a freshly drawn picture. "Look," she said, holding it up. The drawing showed their family standing in a field of wildflowers, the sun shining brightly above them. Michael smiled, his chest swelling with pride and hope. "It's beautiful, Ellie." She nodded, her expression serious. "Do you think this is the last time the sun will go away?" Michael didn't answer right away. Instead, he knelt down to her level and pointed at the drawing. "Do you see all of us standing together in the sunlight?" Elowen nodded. "That's what matters," Michael said. "Whatever happens, as long as we have that, we'll figure it out." She smiled faintly, clutching the drawing to her chest as the sunlight bathed the room. The world was scarred, but not broken, and as the Thompsons stood together under the morning sun, they knew their survival had given them something far more powerful than fear. Hope. And that was The Sunblink by Craig Groshek, performed by yours truly.
You ever just feel like the universe is messing with us, Otis?
Oh, all the time, Malcolm. And after that one, I don't think I'll ever look at the sky the same way again.
Yeah, sometimes it's not what you see, it's what you almost see that sticks with you. Thank you, my friends, for joining us tonight. And if tonight's stories left you craving more, we've got plenty where those came from. For just $7.99 a month, you can unlock extended episodes, exclusive content, and ad-free horror that keeps the nightmares coming.
Just head over to simplyscarypodcast.com, click Patrons, You'll be taken to chillingtalesfordarknights.com, where a whole world of horror awaits.
Support indie horror, skip the ads, and keep the stories coming. What else could be better? Join us today, and as always, we appreciate your support. If you haven't yet, be sure to subscribe to our parent channel, Chilling Tales for Dark Nights on YouTube, and tap that bell icon so you never miss an episode. Once you're there, you'll have access to a vast library of terrifying tales.
And if you're still hungry for more, check out my other podcast, Otis Jiry's Tales from Duskwood, where I bring you even more chilling stories every Wednesday night. You can find it on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts.
Also, don't forget to follow Chilling Tales for Dark Nights on social media, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.
And if you want to chat with me directly, I'd love to hear from you. Look me up on social media and let me know what you thought of tonight's episode.
And last but not least, don't forget the incredible authors behind tonight's stories. Visit their websites, support their work, and help keep independent horror alive.
Well, my friends, that's it for tonight. If you've learned anything, it's that some things refuse to stay buried. Until next time, stay sharp, stay safe, and most importantly, stay scared.
Sweet dreams, listeners. Sweet dreams.
Thanks for listening. You've been listening to Scary Stories Told in the Dark, a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts Network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com today to learn more about our network and our other amazing storytelling programs. Tonight's program was hosted, and its featured stories performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. Selected stories have been adapted with the kind permission of their respective authors. Original music provided by Luke Hodgkinson and Jesse Cornett. Sound design and final mixing and mastering provided by executive producer and director Craig Groshek. Program's artwork and logo by David Romero. If you're looking for some fresh tales on a daily basis while waiting for the next podcast, check out my YouTube channel, the Otis Jiry channel, and my extensive collection of narrated tales there. Simply search on YouTube by my name, and you'll find me. And don't forget to subscribe and press the bell notification icon to get my latest releases. Got a scary tale of your own that you'd like performed? I take submissions. Email it to me today at otis@simplyscarypodcast.com to have your terrifying tome considered for production in a future episode of this show. That's otis@simplyscarypodcast.com. If you've enjoyed what you heard on tonight's program and are joining us on your favorite podcast app, subscribe to us to be sure you never miss an episode, and leave a 5-star review and a comment. Your feedback means a lot to me. You can also follow Chilling Tales for Dark Nights and yours truly on Facebook to connect anytime and get the latest updates on this and other programs and my channel. If you're listening on the Chilling Tales for Dark Nights YouTube channel, do us a favor and hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon for ctfdn as well to get more spooky tales from me and the crew and another episode of this program each and every Wednesday. And don't forget to hit that thumbs up button to tell us how we're doing and leave a kind word or a request. And don't forget to visit us at chillingtalesfordarknights.com and consider supporting the team by becoming a patron. In addition to helping us out, you'll get exclusive access to our audio archive and ad-free downloads of all your favorite stories, including those you've heard on this program. As for me, I'll be back next Wednesday with more terrifying tales to keep you up all night. But that's all right. Who needs sleep anyway?